I want to run through Tom Stafford's career because Tom Stafford, like I said, one of the greatest living Americans. We lost him last Tuesday at the age of 93. Um, and God, let's
Do
just
you
say
want
this
to
about
hold
men like Tom
on.
Stafford.
We can go in.
Legends and
Hold
heroes who
on.
are on that level, they don't die. They pass into legend. And let's talk briefly about why Tom Stafford gets to pass into legend instead of dying. The first time he flew was Gemini 6A. Gemini 6A it was supposed to be a dual flight along with Gemini 6B. Gemini 6B contains Frank Borman and Jim Lovell. First time they ever flew together. Gemini 6A contains Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford. 6B launches first. They're supposed to launch on consecutive days. The Borman and Lovell launched just fine. They're in orbit. They're supposed to stay up for 2 weeks, but Schirra and Stafford are supposed to only stay up long enough to affect history's first in orbit rendezvous. That was the point of launching the two flights so close to each other, so they could do the rendezvous, and then the one A could come back down, B could remain in orbit for 2 weeks because theirs was more of an endurance project. But the big point of the whole thing was to accomplish the rendezvous. Except when 6A launched the day after 6B, it got 4 inches off the pad and then settled back down. And amazingly, the rocket didn't blow up and kill everyone. And it is to Wally Schirra's credit that he didn't freak out and abort, and because then they probably would have both gotten killed, even though the rocket didn't blow up. So now you've got to go back and make repairs. They don't launch until a week later. They accomplish the rendezvous. Everything goes great. Borman and Lovell are up there for the whole 2 weeks and really can't stand each other by the end. So that is Stafford's first flight. His second flight is Gemini 9A, the point of which he's the commander on this flight. He's flying with Gene Cernan in the right-hand seat. This is the second ever American extravehicular activity. The first was Ed White a few months ago. He didn't try to do anything. It was just go outside and see if you can be outside and then come back in, and that goes great. He says, "God, this is fantastic. I feel like $1 million." Chris Kraft actually has to get on the radio loop and tell him to get his ass back in the spacecraft because he's having too much fun. But the second spacewalk, the one that Gene Cernan is supposed to attempt on Gemini 9A, it's the first time that we're having a man try to actually do work outside the spacecraft, because this is something that we're going to have to do if we want to do the manned lunar landing missions that we're planning on trying in a few years. And it goes really badly for Cernan because nobody has ever done this before. Nobody knows what we need or what we have to do or any of the exigencies that are going to come into play. They don't have any handholds on the outside of the spacecraft, so he's trying to do this work he's supposed to do, and he is overexerting himself, and his heart rate is dangerously high, and he is sweating his ass off, and there's nothing in his spacesuit to sublimate sweat with, so all that sweat just kind of sits in your suit, and it becomes a pretty closely run thing whether Cernan is even going to get back in the spacecraft, because Stafford at a certain point says, "This guy is really struggling here. I'm aborting this EVA. I'm getting him back in the spacecraft." And there was some uncertainty whether Cernan was going to be able to get back in without actually passing out and losing consciousness. And if that happens, then Stafford has a fun decision to make, because he doesn't really have any way of cutting Cernan loose if he becomes incapacitated on the outside of the spacecraft and isn't able to get back in. So he's got a bundle of he's got a tether and a wire and a couple of comm cables that are connecting him to the spacecraft. So Stafford, if Cernan becomes incapacitated, either has to cut his lines and cast him loose, or attempt to do the re-entry while actually holding the right-hand hatch down and just hoping that Cernan's blackened corpse breaks loose at some point and he manages to survive. Fortunately, Cernan does manage to ingress the spacecraft. He winds up with a couple of boots full of sweat, All sounded pretty gross. The third time Stafford flies is as the commander of Apollo 10, which is a unique mission because you have 3 Apollo mission commanders flying on the same flight. Stafford is the commander of 10. You've got John Young, who's the commander of 16. And you've got Gene Cernan again, who is the commander of 17, still the last man to walk on the moon up to this very day. They are the second flight ever to go to the moon after Apollo 8. And their whole deal is basically to do a dry run of Apollo 11 and do every single thing in a lunar landing mission except landing on the moon. And they also need to test the lunar module abort procedures, because you have to test those in lunar orbit before you can attempt an actual landing, because you have to make sure the abort procedures work. Apollo 10 goes off without a hitch. It is, one of the lesser known missions today, and that's a hell of a damn shame, because it was really damn important, and they were the guys that paved the road for Neil and Buzz. Buzz, who I should also mention here, because all that trouble that Cernan had on the EVA on Gemini 9A, that only got solved by Buzz Aldrin figuring out that, hey, we need to start training for this stuff underwater in a pool, and we need to start doing all this stuff in slow motion and not overexerting ourselves, because then we don't sweat our asses off, and we can do this pretty easily. We just need to take a less brute force approach than we've been taking. And Aldrin winds up solving all that whole thing, and credit to him. He doesn't get enough credit for that. He gets more notoriety, obviously, for being the second guy to walk on the moon, but that's a whole different thing. The last time Stafford flies is as the American commander of the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975, which was obviously the first and only time that the Americans and the Soviets conducted a joint mission. And it was people today probably don't appreciate what a big deal that was in terms of seeing these two countries act in collaboration and cooperation with each other. And, the American crew went to Russia to live for a while, and they had to speak Russian, and the Russian crew, Commander Sergei Leonov, first man ever to do an EVA, they have to come over here, and they live in Oklahoma at Stafford's place, and in Houston for a while. And there's some fun, famous video of Alexei Leonov with a 10-gallon hat on and at an Oklahoma barbecue, just having a great old time. One of the noteworthy things about that flight was that Stafford was from Oklahoma, and you could tell. Oklahomans have an unmistakable way of speaking the English language and every other language, as it turns out, because the Russian guys, they found it so amusing, the accent that Stafford had when he tried to speak Russian, that they actually named it as its own dialect, which they called Oklahomsky. And Stafford and Leonov, the two commanders, they actually developed a very close, lifelong friendship with one another, as a lot of astronauts and cosmonauts did when they had a chance to meet and spend time with each other at air shows in third countries and whatnot. And why wouldn't they? Because how many people are there in the world who have similar experiences to the ones you have? So it seems obvious that they would all want to gravitate toward one another. It is one of the most prolific and distinguished careers in the history of space flight, and it always will be. And Stafford was just such a great personality in general. Every one of the documentaries that he was in just benefited immeasurably from his presence. He was an American hero. His watch has ended, and we shall not see his like again. Godspeed, General Stafford. A grateful nation salutes you.
Absolutely. God bless.